Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final countdown, Prepare for SQL End of Service webinar. Microsoft SQL Server 2008 and 2008 End of Life is just weeks away on July 9th. And we're here today to help you raise awareness surrounding the different options available to you. Joining us here to help you understand the options available is Larry Swanky, Director of Catapult's Azure Cloud Practice, and Sri Ganapathy. Cannot say that, sorry, Sri. I think I just butchered your name. He is the Partner Technology Strategist with Microsoft. We'll get started shortly, but just a few housekeeping notes first. So this webinar is going to be just at an hour long. And you may ask questions at any time during the webinar in the chat box to the right of your screen. It's labeled chat. And then at the last 15 minutes of the webinar, we will allow for Q&A. So we'll answer those questions at that time. And then if we don't get all of your questions answered, we'll follow up with you individually after the webinar to answer those. We also have a few poll questions that we're going to ask today. So just to kind of gauge where you are at in the migration process. And then we will also follow up with a short survey post-webinar to see how we did. And from there, Larry, I'm going to let you run with it.
Sure, just a quick intro. My name is Larry Swanky. I'm the Solutions Director for Azure for Catapult. I've actually been working with SQL Server for 19 years now, going back to my early days at Microsoft. So I've got a lot of experience about all the way back to SQL 2000, helping customers evaluate the latest version, migrate to Azure and everything else. Sri, you want to give a little background?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Larry. This is Sri Ganapathy with Microsoft. Been with Microsoft close to 20 years now. And I have a similar background like Larry, been working with SQL Server for almost 20 years now, starting from, I think, version 6.0. So I've been in support, sales, consulting, and in my current role, I work with Catapult and work closely with them. And they are one of our top partners from a Microsoft perspective for SQL Server migrations and Azure in general.
As a matter of fact, Sri and I worked closely together on a team while we were both at Microsoft around SQL and Azure, so we got a lot of experience together. Let me go ahead and go over the agenda. We're going to go over what options you have to keep your business free of disruptions, the tools and procedures to accelerate your SQL cloud transformation. We're going to talk about both PaaS and IaaS scenarios, what those are in Azure. We'll talk about the business technical benefits, expanding into Azure. And I really want to use, as I go throughout this presentation, and Sri as well, we're going to use our experience about what we're seeing customers do out there, how they're going about the inventory, the assessment, the migration, and everything else. So we're going to go through some best practices, lessons learned, and everything else. So let's start with the high end is, what is SQL 2008 R2 end of service, end of support mean? What that means is Microsoft will no longer release security updates for SQL Server 2008 R2 unless a customer has a custom support agreement. So if you have those running, and I think Microsoft estimated at one time 50% of all companies or 50% of all SQL usage worldwide was still doing 2008 or 2008 R2. You won't get, after July 9th, you will not get any security updates to that after that product unless you move it to Azure or do the things below. So you do have some options. One is do nothing, and we certainly have customers that just take the risk and say, hey, we're just going to roll the dice and run on old versions until we get upgraded to a later one. You can upgrade to a supported version of SQL Server, 2012, 2014, 16, Azure, and so on. You can purchase an extended support agreement. Those can be very expensive, up to 300% of the cost of your software assurance. I think for a SQL, I did a calculation for SQL Enterprise Edition with 16 cores. I think it would cost you about, I estimated over $200,000 a year to get a custom support agreement, extended support agreement on that. Or you can migrate those servers and applications as is into Azure. And if you do that, you get 3 years of security updates at no extra cost from Microsoft. So you can extend the life of those SQL servers into Azure and get those security updates as well. So those are some of the options that we have. Of course, on this call, we're going to talk mainly about moving into Azure. So I think we have a poll right now, and go ahead and put that poll question out there. All right. I think we've had a number of people answer that poll. So if we go ahead and close the poll, and we can see those answers. All right. So I'm sorry, sharing poll results right now. So it's coming out. Okay, so as those poll results are getting together, we'll move on. This is not meant to be a marketing deck for why cloud, but a lot of people still have questions about why moving into Azure. So this is just something that a lot of customers tell us about, that they look at the cost benefits, the ability to scale up and down quickly, new services, anytime, anywhere, reduce cost. Well, I will tell you what I see the most out there, and I would say this is based on 400 cloud engagements over the last 6 years. Azure engagements, over 150 just in the last year and a half is what I see customers making a decision on, is either end of life of a hardware, end of contract and an outsourcing agreement, a mission critical app that they just have to get hyperscale on and just can't continue to buy hardware. And I tell you, the number one change we see a lot right now is this new leadership. We see a new CIO come on board that is cloud, open to cloud, has bought into it. And I can't tell you how many times over the last year when I've gotten on a call with the customer that said, hey, we've got our CFO bought into the cloud, everybody else is as well. How can you help get us into Azure as quickly as possible? So those are some of the things that we're seeing. You know, a lot of cloud vendors out there. I don't think you can go wrong choosing Microsoft. Matter of fact, I know you can't. Just the number of services that Microsoft is continuing to deploy in Azure, the tuning and the improvement they're doing on how you can automate, you know, server management, deployment, and everything in Azure. But I would say the number one reason is if you're running SQL Server on a Windows server, you might as well run it on the company that earned it or invented it and continues to maintain it, which is Azure. And we'll go over some cost benefits. One of those things we'll go over is hybrid use benefits, that you actually get a cost savings by running your SQL and Windows servers in Azure, so over other cloud vendors. One thing, just so you know, we used to hear a lot, not so much anymore, but we used to hear a lot about why should I get in the cloud? You know, it's not very secure, and how do I know that my stuff is secure up there? There's really only two answers to that. One is understand what your role is in security. You know, what are your company policies, corporate intellectual property, employee roles, governance, you know, your HIPAA requirement, PCI, everything else. Understand your role in security versus Microsoft's. Because you can go to Microsoft's Trust Center and see all the things that Microsoft does to make sure that that data center is secure. As far as I know, to this day, no one has hacked into an Azure data center because of a vulnerability on Microsoft's side. No matter where you put your stuff, on-prem, colo, in the cloud, if you don't have the right policies and everything in place, you could be at risk. So just understand the differences between those two. So now we're going to get into assessment and modeling. And what this is focused on are the things and steps that you need to look at in assessing your current SQL 2008 R2, or even just SQL environment in general. Or if you want, assessing your entire data center. So this is the lessons that we've learned. These are the methodologies that we use and steps that we use. We'll talk about the tools and everything as well. And I know everybody's going to get a copy of this, so you'll be able to leverage this as you go forward. So think about it this way. You have to have an on-premise assessment, and we'll go over the tools that you can use to do that, some free ones and some paid ones. You have to understand what your operational assessment is, what is the likelihood of those applications and servers being deprecated, maybe move into a SaaS system, maybe have to stay on premise due to storage requirements or due to a deprecation schedule. Why move it into the cloud if it's going to go away in 6 months? Understand the differences in your SQL workloads. PaaS stands for Platform as a Service. IaaS stands for Infrastructure as a Service. And Sri's going to spend a lot of time talking about how Microsoft has offerings around both of those. The most important thing you do, identify the applications and systems that go with those databases. You really can't move a database, a server into Azure without the associated application. So a lot of the work that we do with customers is we identify the databases or the servers and the applications associated with them and the workloads. Those are the IOPS and the storage and how many users and uptime and everything else, but we'll go into more detail about that. So as I said, your assessment goal is to identify all the servers across your data center environment, whether you have one data center, multiple data centers, a colo. Some people have hybrid where they have a colo, they have an on-premise data center, and then they have cloud as well. So identify all the hardware, all the VMs, everything running. Analyze your workload configuration, look at the applications associated with those servers and databases. And I'll go into best practices at the end and lessons learned. But one thing I'll tell you right now is in 19 years of doing this, 17 years at Microsoft, or 15 years at Microsoft, and 4 years at Catapult, what I found is this: out of every assessment and inventory that we've done at a customer, 100% of the time, and I've done thousands of these, 100% of the time customers have found a server or an application that they didn't know about. We thought we retired that server, so it's going to be important to understand your workload configuration, applications. There could be an application someone accesses 1 day a month, and if you don't have a good assessment tool, you're going to miss that. And as one of my customers found out, they decommissioned that database, and on the last day of the month, someone said, "Where's my app database? It's not working." Understand your bandwidth requirements and your networking configuration today. Definitely have to understand your storage needed, and then do a total cost of ownership. Not just the cost of your consumption, but there's a lot of ancillary things that we look at as well for customers. Hardware, cost of infrastructure, cost of cooling, cost of electricity, cost of maintaining and everything. So there's a lot of costs as opposed to just consumption cost in Azure to look at. But it's good to get, and Microsoft has a lot on their Azure website, a lot of tools that you can use to calculate all this out. Identify your databases that are running on those servers. What does that footprint look like? As I said, the workload configuration, networking, virtual storage. This is kind of a summary of the previous slide, but I would start with this as, okay, if we're going to do an assessment of what we have, just SQL 2008 R2, let's start with this list and go from there. My recommendation, if you're going to do this type of analysis, do it across the whole data center. You might be surprised some of the things that you find. So here's the tools that you can use. And I've divided these up between low cost or no cost tools. I don't say no cost because there is a cost of people and process, but the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Services tool, that's called the MAPS Toolkit, that is free. It's a free download. There's the data migration assessment that you can use to see what are your databases and how are they ready for Azure, especially Azure PaaS, Platform as a Service. There's an Azure Migrate tool that combined with Microsoft and Assessment and Planning Services will not only do the inventory, but we'll look at your applications as well. So those are free tools. You can just go out and Bing it. This is a Microsoft call, so I'm not going to say the G word to go search it. So Bing it, and you can get access to those tools. And there's a lot of videos on YouTube on how to run them. There's a lot of education you can use to run those tools. There are other tools that we use. We use a tool called StratoZone a lot. We use a tool called Mover, Turbonomics, and Cloudomize. You have to pay for these tools, but we have found they're, of course, since you're paying for them, they're more comprehensive. On average, we have found that those tools save us about 3 to 5 days of work in doing a full data center assessment for a customer where they have 100, 200, or 300 VMs. If you're just, trying to find 10 SQL 2008 servers out there and associated, probably not cost benefit to pay for those, but you can if you want. And they do automate a lot of that. They automate the assessment. They automate the findings. They do a preliminary consumption analysis in Azure. Produce a lot of really nice graphs. So those tools you can pay for. All right, I think we have another poll now.
Okay, you guys, we are opening the poll. The poll is located in the kind of right navigation section. So to answer that poll, this question is just yes or no. So we'll give you about 10, 15 seconds to answer that. Okay, the poll is now closed.
Okay. Are you going to give those results now or at the end?
Yeah, so the poll results are, as you can see, I think you can see on your screen, they are 50-50. Okay. 50-50.
All right. In addition to doing assessment tools, you can also do cloud vendors such as ourselves. We're a systems integrator, 100% Microsoft focused, and we're a certified partner. We've done over 150 cloud assessments for Azure just in the last 3 years, close to 200 migrations. I would say the most important thing you need to know about choosing someone to help you out with, or if you're going to choose someone to help you out in this journey, is that what we try to do with customers is we try to answer the questions. They don't know what they don't know. And let me give you an example of that. If a customer says, hey, we're going to lift and shift this into Azure, we're going to say, well, is that the best thing that you can do? Are these systems, can they be consolidated? Can we, instead of moving 10 SQL servers into Azure as is, can we consolidate some of them? The IOPS show that, or the usage of these servers are underutilized. So instead of going to 10 VMs in Azure, you might go to 5. Here are the cost benefits of that. So when you go with a vendor such as ourselves, or a Microsoft certified vendor, what you're getting is that expertise of someone that's done it a lot before that can say, hey, you got to think about this first. This is what's important because, you said this is part of your business. This is mission critical. So these are things you need to think about. All right. And Shri, I think we're going to let you cover the PaaS and IaaS now because this is important. So I'm going to turn it over to Shri now and just say next slide when you're ready, Shri.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Larry. So hope you all can hear me fine. So in the next few minutes, what I'm going to do is to walk through some of the options you have when you move SQL Server to the cloud. Larry talked about the different options to take care of the support expiring that's coming up, the end of support that's coming up. And one of those options is obviously to move to the cloud, which is the preferred or suggested option because there are a lot of benefits of doing that. And there's a couple of different ways of doing that, which is what I'm going to go through. So this slide talks about the primary options that we have. And Larry alluded to this earlier. The one option that you can think of is using a platform as a service or PaaS offering. We call that Azure SQL Database. And then the other option is to run SQL Server on VMs, which we call infrastructure as a service. So we're going to go and look at both these options, think about what are the pros and cons of each, and what do each offer. So if you move to the next slide, Larry. The first option is the Azure SQL Database. So what is the Azure SQL Database? So the Azure SQL Database is our fully managed relational database service in the cloud. It runs the same SQL Server engine that you all are probably familiar with, except it is offered as a managed service in the cloud. What that means is that as an end user or as a customer, you don't have to worry about tuning the backend, creating high availability, setting up security, patching the OS, upgrading to different versions, etc. All that is handled by Microsoft. So it's a fully managed service. So what you as an end user, developer, customer, etc. are worried about is your application. How do you make sure that your application runs on top of that database engine, which is managed for you? So there are four primary benefits, as the slide highlights, as to why you would want to consider running it on Azure SQL Database. The first one is the built-in intelligence. So what do we mean by built-in intelligence? So within Azure SQL Database, we have a lot of intelligence that helps dynamically figure out what performance options need to be tuned. So we have something called as a performance advisor as an example. So things that you would normally have to troubleshoot on your own on the back end on an on-premises type installation are taken away from you with this built-in intelligence, which dramatically reduces the cost of running and managing databases and maximizes both the performance and security of your application. The next one that's interesting to think about here is the breakthrough productivity and performance. So just like you have the same on-premises installation where you're running mission critical application, the Azure SQL Database provides breakthrough productivity and performance to meet the demands of most of your applications. So each database, for example, is isolated from each other and portable, and each has its own service tier with a guaranteed performance level. And SQL Database also provides different performance levels for different needs. So you can kind of choose which performance tier you want. So there's lots of different options. And you can dynamically scale them, right? So as your demand of the application grows. So for example, let's say you are a retailer and before Thanksgiving, your performance requirements increase significantly. Well, with dynamic scaling, you simply can allocate more processing and computing power to your SQL database, and then you can scale it back down once that the peak period is done. It's just the advantages of cloud that you're familiar with, but all done automatically for you without you having to configure extra servers and all that kind of good stuff. Also within productivity and performance, we have in-memory technologies, which really provide real-time business insight. So it actually gives you up to 30x improved throughput and latency. And I think some of the tests that we have done has given us about 100x faster querying and reporting. So significant improvements in productivity and performance. And then in terms of like moving your data to the cloud, we want to make it as seamless as possible. And so the SQL Server, Azure SQL Database has the same programming surface area like your on-premises applications uses, which means you can seamlessly lift and shift your applications to the cloud. So without having to re-architect your applications, etc. And the last but not the least is a competitive TCO. So Microsoft offers a financially backed SLA for business continuity, things like high availability and disaster recovery. We actually give you certain guarantees in terms of SLAs and financially back them. So if you cannot meet those SLAs, then they're financially backed. And those are kind of like the primary benefits of Azure SQL Database, which is the one of the options, right, for moving to the cloud, which is a platform as a service option. If you move to the next slide, Larry.
You bet.
There are a few different ways. So when you talk about Azure SQL Database, there is a few different options that you can run the Azure SQL Database on. So the first one is, as the slide shows here, a managed instance, which is what we would recommend. So one of the, and this is something that we introduced after a lot of feedback from our customers. So one of the downsides of moving typically to a fully managed option like that is a lot of your existing applications, let's say you have third-party applications that are running on top of your SQL database, sometimes they become not compatible because now you're running in a managed environment versus you running the service on your own. With the managed instance, we have actually taken care of that by making sure that the programming model is exactly familiar and fully compatible to your on-premises installation, which means that even though you're modernizing your environment by moving to the cloud, your existing applications are still compatible. The other two options, single and elastic pool, are meant for different purposes. Single is whenever, let's say you're completely building a new application. So you're not migrating from on-premises, you're actually building a brand new application. Then you'd want to just choose a single standalone managed database instance because that gives you the additional tunes and knobs that you can use for that. And last but not the least is the elastic pool. This is meant for multi-tenant applications. So you may be an independent software vendor that you use a SQL database, but you have multiple applications that are running on it. For doing that, we have the elastic pool, which is actually a shared resource model, which is the best for greater efficiency through that multi-tenant model. So you have different sub options, if you will, under the SQL database managed instance, and they're all running it in a PaaS or a platform as a service tier. If you move to the next slide, the second option, other than PaaS, is running it on virtual machines. So this is probably the one that most people are familiar with. When they talk about moving to the cloud, typically they run it as, VM containers or infrastructure services on the cloud. And so this is obviously possible with SQL Server also. And this gives you the least friction in terms of application compatibility. It's a direct lift and shift, but you're still responsible for patching the server, for maintaining the versions, for configuring high availability and all that kind of stuff. So you still do a lot of the work on your side, and you're using the cloud simply as the data center, a remote data center, where you don't have to worry about provisioning hardware, but you're still responsible for managing the SQL Server environment. It's still an option that you can consider. Like I said, I mean, a lot of customers start with this option because it's the easiest, because you're probably already running virtual machines in your on-premises infrastructure, and you're simply then now creating those same VMs in the cloud, and everything remains compatible. And again, one of the things that we introduced in SQL 2017 was running SQL Server on Linux as well. So not only can you run SQL Server on Windows, but you can also run SQL Server on Linux, which means you can run it on Linux VMs on the cloud. And this has actually provided a lot of flexibility for our customers that are traditionally Linux shops, but had to run their SQL Server environment in Windows, now have an option of also being able to run this on Linux environments. And we have seen some really good performance improvements and other benefits, flexibility of deployment, etc., by running that on Linux environments. So to summarize, there are two options of moving SQL Server to the cloud. One is moving it to our platform as a service offering called SQL Azure Database, which is a fully managed service, or you can run SQL Server on virtual machines, where you can run it either on the Windows version or the Linux version. And you can see the operating system support for Linux here. You have Red Hat, SUSE Linux, and Ubuntu. Now let's talk about some of the customer success that we have had and by moving SQL Server to the cloud. So if you move to the next slide. So ever since we released SQL Server on Linux in 2017, we have had about 2 million pulls, Docker pulls of the SQL Server instance, meaning that there is significant market share of SQL Server today. So when the reason we count it as Docker pulls is because with SQL Server on Linux, we are now offering it simply as a container. Docker is one of the container software that Microsoft uses. And so all you get is a simple image that you download, and then you with a command line tool you just deploy SQL Server. Gone are the days where you have to allocate 2 or 3 hours to install SQL Server. With Docker pulls, it's become really simple. And you can see some customer testimonials there of some of the customers that are using SQL Server on Linux, that it was incredibly easy for them to move even from Windows to Linux. If you want to move from Windows to Linux, that's possible. And again, you can run all of these as VMs on the cloud. If you move to the next slide, I'm going to talk about a couple of specific customers that have used SQL Server on Linux and how they've taken advantage of it by moving into the cloud. You see some logos here: DocuSign, Infosys, Stack Overflow. There are many, many other customer examples. This is just a sampling of some of the case studies that we have of customers that have moved SQL Server successfully to the cloud. So let's talk about one of them that this slide shows, which is DD01. If you move to the next slide, Larry. So DD01 is a financial services company. They're a fintech company that specializes in loan intelligence platform. And what they had was they were currently experiencing platform slowdowns and significant performance slowdowns, and they had a PostgreSQL version that they were running on premises. And so they did a lot of analysis, and because they were a Linux shop, they also wanted to stay in the Linux operating system environment. But with the introduction of SQL Server on Linux, they worked with Microsoft and moved their PostgreSQL backend to SQL Server on Linux on the cloud. And by doing that, as you can see in the slide, they had significant improvements both in performance and reducing the query times from about 30 to 2 seconds. And overall management, because now it's all in the cloud, the overall management time reduced significantly by 90%, because all the the hardware provisioning and all the other benefits that the cloud provides are taken away from the customer, and they were able to see simplified dev operations, and also overall they were delivering insights for their investors. At the end of the day, it's about the business performance that they're able to deliver, and they were able to deliver insights for investors about 15 times faster than what they had before they moved to the cloud. We will summarize this with one more example. So if you move to the next slide, Larry.
Yep.
So Human Tech is another company, and again, there are many examples. I picked a couple here to kind of highlight some of the business benefits and also the performance benefits that customers have realized by moving to the cloud. And with end of support coming up, this is the best opportunity for everybody to realize this benefit by using that compelling event and doing the same. So Human Tech is another company. They're one of the world's largest providers of ergonomics consulting and software services. And what they were after is they want to standardize their IT environment. So not only do they want to take advantage of end of support and move SQL Server to the latest and greatest versions, but they also want to standardize their IT environment. And in that case, they wanted to have one operating system, which was Linux. And then they also wanted to make sure that they still use SQL Server because they were using that already on premises. And so what they did was they migrated SQL Server 2008 to 2017, and they did that on Linux and on the cloud. And by doing that, what they realized was that not only was the migration very seamless and easy, but they also were able to significantly reduce costs and boost efficiency. And you can see some of the codes here. Things like restoring the databases, was a very easy process for them, and upgrading the SQL Server to the cloud was also seamless for them. And their goal, like the code says there, was for their solutions to be durable, off the shelf, and minimally customized. So they don't want to go in and do a lot of customization, which is why they chose SQL Server on the cloud, because with that, they were able to, with the managed instance that I talked about earlier, they didn't really have to worry about a lot of the application compatibility issues that you normally encounter otherwise. So that's the last example I had about another customer that's successfully moving to the cloud. And like Larry mentioned, there are lots of tools and options to be able to do this, but the key is to go through the process, to be able to assess, to be able to plan it and migrate it. And that's where Catapult, our Microsoft Gold partner, comes into play. They've done an excellent job with many of these customers in being able to completely go through the process of planning, using the tools, and migrate, which Larry is going to talk about some more here.
Yep. So for now, let's kind of summarize where we are. You have SQL 2008 and 2008 R2 in production today. Your choices are to do nothing and run the risk of a security problem, to upgrade to a later version, which we know takes time and effort and cost, to purchase a support agreement, which costs money as well, or to migrate into Azure. And what we're going to talk about is the planning and migration strategies, or things that you need to think about. So if you've done the great assessment, you know what you have, you know everything what the applications are, application mapping, database sizes, everything else. Now you can start looking at how to plan to get those into Azure. And the two things that you want to evaluate that in moving into Azure are, am I going to migrate these into just a straight VM? In other words, instead of running on a VM in my data center or on my colo, it runs on a VM in Azure. Or is it time to look at upgrading those and moving those into a platform as a service type, modernizing? And what we see is both. I will tell you that in the last 3 months, it's almost like all the customers woke up and said, wait a second, SQL's end of life. We need to do something, because we have doubled the number of assessments we did just in the last 3 months. And along with that, customers are saying, what's best for us? If we're, I always like to use the example, if you're going to, buy a brand new Porsche, and are you going to take a new Porsche and then take an old VW engine and put it in it? No, you're going to have the latest and greatest. So if you're moving an application into Azure with the database, maybe you want to look at upgrading it and getting some performance out of it as well. So here's your migration checklist. Your migration strategies are IaaS and PaaS. Your deprecation, are those servers going to go away? Do we need them anymore? Your network connectivity. I always say there's 3 components of cost in Azure. There's your VM compute, the VMs that you're using. How much is that costing you? Your network. Microsoft doesn't charge you to get data into Azure, but they charge you for egress to get data out of Azure. And then your storage. And I'll tell you that the cost of storage is going down almost like every 6 months. So, the cost of storage is cheap in the cloud. Yeah, definitely have to do identity and Active Directory. The biggest mistake we see customers make is they don't set their Active Directory up correctly in Azure, and they have problems down the line for that. If you're running Office 365 already, you've already got a good start. Your application migration, and then tools and processes. So that's your checklist. We'll go through that. Oh, we do have another poll.
All right, you guys. So please, on the right-hand side, answer those poll questions that just popped up. We'll give you about 10 to 15 seconds. All right, we're okay, you guys. So, Larry, to give you a breakdown of the poll questions, 43% customer developed, 29% off the shelf, and 29% software as a service.
Oh, that's good to know. That's good to know because as you know, as you're going through your assessment, let me get back into the presentation. As you're going through your assessment, the off the shelf, you know, that's where you go ask them, do you support Azure? Do you support the latest version of SQL? Do you support managed platform as a service in SQL? So you can go to that. The software as a service, you're already running a software as a service, so that, you know, doesn't need to go anywhere, but there may be some integration capabilities within Azure. And then custom app, that's what we find customers spend the most amount of time evaluating and moving that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So in looking at your Azure network connectivity, you have two choices. You can pay for ExpressRoute, which is Microsoft's dedicated pipe into the Azure data center, or you can stick with your virtual private network. I will tell you, most of our customers start off with the VPN, their own VPN, and then as their usage gets more, they have it in the budget to do ExpressRoute. The only time that I've seen customers purchase ExpressRoute first is when it's a mission critical application, and they just don't have the bandwidth today to support that in Azure. So I would say if you have a VPN today, that's going to handle 90% of your needs as you move into Azure, but you definitely want to have a roadmap just in case of looking at ExpressRoute. Application migration. We do have customers that, you know, do a hybrid scenario. We are not saying that just because you're looking at moving into Azure that you have to close your data center down and move everything into Azure. We do have customers doing that today, but a lot of customers have a hybrid scenario where they want to keep some applications in their data center or in their colo, or they want to take some applications and move those into, and databases and servers and move those into Azure. So don't think right away we have 100 VMs, we're moving those into Azure in the next 3 months. I will tell you, we've done that for some customers who lost their colo and it closed, and they came to us and said, we got everything in Azure in 3 months. We don't care how it goes. It's got to go because we don't have a choice. Then it's your application migration. You look at either an IaaS solution, so you rehost, lift and shift into IaaS. In that, the main thing that you have to look at is performance. Every single database or SQL server I've looked at with customers is underutilized in an on-prem or a colo situation. It's running at 20% capacity. So don't think just because you have a 16 core assigned to it with you know, however many gigabytes of RAM in your on-premise that you need to provision the exact same thing in Azure. It needs to be right-sized. So I just did a cost analysis for a customer last week that, you know, their initial cost analysis was, I think, $700,000 a year, and they just said, like for like, this is what we have. And after we went through the assessment, and it was like half that. So they definitely had to over provisioned what they would need in Azure. So you can also do replatform or in PaaS, and I'll go into a little bit more about what I've learned about that. And please don't think that you know, a custom off the shelf or a SaaS replacement is off the table. When we do an assessment, again, customers are surprised to find that they have 5 different applications doing the same thing. And they're like, oh, wow, we can consolidate those, or we could go to SaaS for that. So in doing an assessment, it's not, hey, everything has to move to Azure. You have these three as well. You know, some for IaaS, some for PaaS, some stays on premise, some go away, some replace with SaaS. So you do have a lot of options when you're looking at that. You have a lot of choices for Azure database migration tools. You have the Azure Portal, you have the SQL Server Management Studio, Azure Migration Wizard, SQL Server Data Tools and Visual Studio, Data Migration Assistant, Azure Site Recovery. I will tell you how it typically goes with our customers. They pick out some servers that need to be migrated into Azure. You know, we help them with the assessment, we right-size them. We help them set up Azure if they've never done that before, set up their AD correctly, set up their Azure subscription. Then we provision the VMs, and then we use Azure Site Recovery to move those into Azure. Non-production first, test dev, then we do production, but we don't do a cutover until the testing is complete. And then once testing is complete, then those go to production. A lot of times what they do is they use Azure as their production environment, and then they keep their on-premise as a backup, maybe as a DR site. I'll tell you some insight that if you have 12 VMs, you're going to migrate into Azure. It's going to take you about 2 hours per VM using Azure Site Recovery to migrate those into Azure. So just put that into your time. It's not instantaneous. And then of course, data as well. You know, we have customers, one customer had petabytes of data, and you know, they were thinking, man, this is going to take a year to migrate it, and they didn't realize that Microsoft does have a solution where, you know, you can put it on a truck and ship it there. So you can put it on disk or storage, whatever you have, and ship it to Microsoft, and they'll put it in Azure for you. So you don't necessarily have to use the bandwidth if you're talking about petabytes of data, and you probably wouldn't want to do that. Data Migration Assistant, let me talk about that for a second. It's a free tool from Microsoft. It will evaluate your current databases and applications for compatibility in Azure Platform as a Service, so Azure Managed Database. I will tell you when you run the tool, again, here's a little trick. You'll run the tool. It's an easy to use tool. It will kick back an Excel spreadsheet for you and say, here's compatibility errors. And we recently did this for a customer, and they were, I'm just going to use the word, they were freaked out because there was 1,000 errors. And so like, oh no, we can never move this into Azure. This is terrible. And we looked at it and said, it's the same error 1,000 times. All you have to do is make one change and it's compatible. And so they felt a lot happier about that. So don't just think because you have 1,000 error codes or 500 error codes, whatever, kicked out by the database migration assistant, that's a big deal. It may not be a big deal. So again, Sri did a great job about going over this, but you do have you have solutions. You have SQL and Azure, which is PaaS, which again, as Sri said, you don't do anything with Azure database after that. I mean, Microsoft is managing it for you. That's a managed instance of SQL Server. You could put SQL on an Azure VM, which is IaaS. Again, you're responsible for that database then. You know, if you don't patch it, you know, it's not staying compliant. So you're responsible for the Azure data, the SQL database in that aspect. Or you can use managed services partners. We're managed service partners a lot out there where you can outsource the whole thing and so you run it for us. So you do have some options. All right, so I'm going to go into lessons learned now. If there's any questions, make sure you put it into the chat window. But I'm going to go into lessons learned. This is based on all the engagements that I've personally been involved in since starting with 2010 with Microsoft through now, so for the last 9 years. Just things to keep in mind. First of all, this is a result from a tool that we used. For a customer, this is a paid tool, so we used, I think, StratoZone for this. And what is nice about it, it's going to aggregate and do a lot of the analysis for you. So as I said, it saves us about 3 to 5 days worth of work on doing analysis on this. And so it came up with all the active server tools. I'm sorry, this was Mover. All the active inventory of the SQL servers, how many databases on those SQL servers, the SQL versions, that are in mainstream support, extended support, and so on. So this is something that will kick out from this automated tool. You run it. We recommend you run the tool for at least 2 to 4 weeks so you can capture a lot of the application usage, how many users, the IOPS, peak times, peak workloads, and so on. They help you fine-tune your move into Azure. What we did for this customer, and let me mention that now, is if you move a Windows VM or SQL VM into Azure, Microsoft has something called that hybrid use benefits. So not only do you get extended support for moving into Azure, no cost, so you get security updates, but you get hybrid use benefits. Hybrid use benefits is, think of it this way, you bring your own license into Azure, so why would Microsoft charge you for running a Windows VM when you already have a license for a Windows server? So we have seen cost savings up to 60% for some customers. And be very clear, Microsoft is the only cloud vendor that offers hybrid use benefits. The other competitors can't offer it because they don't own the license for Windows Server. So Microsoft says, hey, you own a license, we're Microsoft, we're not going to double charge you for that Windows Server license. So these tools do a lot of that hybrid use benefits for you as well, and do a lot of the automation and aggregation of the data for you. All right, so you run a tool, either it's Maps, Azure Migrate, or you pay for a tool to use and you run it. First of all, discovery is going to take longer than you think. As I said, we recommend somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks of running a tool. It doesn't stop there, because you're going to come back with servers, either database servers, SQL servers, or applications that you don't know what they are. So you have to build in time into your assessment to track those down. We did one recently for a large city organization. They had 100 SQL servers, 2008 R2 that were still running. Some of the applications associated with those SQL servers were 30 years old, and they didn't know who used them anymore. So it's going to take time. So just build that into your timeline. And just because we get a report doesn't mean it's an end-all be-all report. You're going to have to go in there and say, okay, what is the application life cycle for some of these? Can some of these servers applications be deprecated? They're going to go away in 6 months. Why move them into Azure? Can some of them be upgraded and consolidated into a SaaS or a custom or an off-the-shelf application? Then let's do that. So that takes time. Also, be prepared for surprises. As I said, I've been doing this for almost 20 years. And I've been running these types of tools with customers, inventory tools and assessment tools on SQL for that length of time as well. 100% of time, 100%, my customers have found something that surprised them. So you just need to be aware of that. You might find something that we thought and I hear this all the time. Well, we got rid of that server 3 years ago. No, you didn't, and it's still running. Oh, what is there? There's a SQL 2000 server still out there? Yes, there is, and then they have to go track that down. So just be aware of that. So plan accordingly to adjust scope and time frame for that. And there is a cost to using free tools, and that cost is free, is time. The free tools are good, and they're good enough, but they will cost you time on doing some of the manual consolidation and aggregation and costing in Azure, as opposed to the for fee tools that will do that for you. So let me go over the lessons learned also on customers that are migrating into Azure. As I said, if you make the determination, we are moving these servers into Azure, these SQL servers have to go. You've done the assessment, you've done the analysis, you've done an optimization, you have sized out your VMs correctly, you have a pretty good idea of what that cost is, you did a hybrid use benefits, and you're ready to go. The first step is you have to have an Azure Foundation around Active Directory correctly. You got to get AD Connect set up in Azure. If you've never done that, there is a website. Sorry, I forgot to put that in here. There's a website, and I'll tell it to you what to search for. Again, if you just Bing the word Azure Scaffold, like a scaffold that you build, SCAFFOLD, you will come up with a website for Microsoft. It's a blog site, and it lists the best practices for setting up Azure governance and Active Directory. So if you've never done anything in Azure, that is your first step. And the number 3 remediation and workload we do in Azure is remediating customers' Active Directory and subscription in Azure that they set it up wrong. And that's the first step we tell customers to go to. We have a Azure Foundation we do for customers that takes between 5 and 7 days to set that all up correctly and train them how to use it and everything. That's your first step. Your second step is you've done that. We're ready to migrate. We know which VMs we're going to use. The second step you have to do then is to understand the Azure Monitor and the Azure Portal. So you can understand your cost and how those costs can go out of control. I will tell you that I worked with one customer who their cost exceeded what they thought it was going to be because they had someone provision the wrong SQL server. They provisioned a very large SQL server when they didn't need to do that. So just be aware that, you know, it is, I hear this from customers all the time. The cloud is easy. You spin up a VM, you can get one spun up today in 5 minutes, but it's not simple. You spin up the wrong one, it can be very cost consuming. So those are some of the lessons that we've learned. We do have a quick start offer, and we've done this for a lot of customers where if you want to use us, we can help you migrate 5 SQL servers into Azure, get those up to run, get those up and running for you, get them running securely, and teach you how to do that. Make sure it's set up with Azure hybrid use benefits, because you do have to set that up correctly to get the Azure use benefits. But we've helped a number of customers move their SQL environments into Azure. So this is definitely something we can help you with as well. And that's it. That is our time. Are there any questions that came through?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. And right now, if anybody else has questions, please take the time to enter them into the Q&A portion off to the right of your screen. But Larry, I'll just go ahead and read them aloud to you if that's all right. So the first one is, can I keep some data on premise and some on the cloud without having to move everything to the cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a hybrid scenario that we see customers go with, and we see more customers going with the hybrid scenarios than anything else. But the most important thing is in your analysis and inventory and assessment, which ones can go, which ones should stay. But you can certainly do that. We have a number of customers that do that.
Okay, great. Another question that just came through, what versions of SQL does Azure support?
Well, as a VM, it supports 2003, not 2000, not SQL 2000, but starting with 2008, correct? I think Shree's on mute. Yeah, so I would start with.
Yeah, that's right, Larry. Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I mean, as far as the VMs are concerned, I mean, you know, anything that supported version is good enough. Yep.
So we have not seen anyone run anything earlier than SQL 2008 in Azure.
Okay, and it looks like those were the 2 questions that came through. Larry, Shree, anything else that you want to include before I wrap things up?
Just say plan. If you do your planning and assessment and inventory correctly, then migrating those servers into Azure is not a big deal.
Okay. All right, great. Well, I just want to say thank you to Larry and thank you, Shree, for your time today and all of just the very insightful information. As Larry mentioned, Catapult does have a quick start offer. There is we do have a couple handouts that are included. That's included on the right navigation, and that is just a kind of a one-pager about our Quick Start offer. We also included the PowerPoint for today's presentation, and then we will ask a short survey here at the end, just to gauge your level of interest or where you're at, and if you would like us to follow up with you post webinar. And again, really thank you guys for your time, and thank you for everyone who joined the webinar today. All right.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Have a great day. Goodbye.